Rockets fans, welcome to the Rockets Launch Pod, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets, Sports Talk 790. Rockets! Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Rockets Launch Pod starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of the Rockets Launch Pod presented by Clutch Fans. I'm Ben DuBose. He's Paulo Alves. It's Thursday, the 11th of June. The NBA Finals still in progress between the New York Knicks and the hated San Antonio Spurs. And so that's primarily what we're going to be discussing today, albeit from a Rockets perspective. As far as any specific rumors for the team and potential transactions that are related to this year's or next year's roster, I promise we'll pick that up very soon. It's quiet at the moment, but I think as soon as the finals end, you're going to see the rumor mill pick up all around the NBA. And there's two primary reasons for that. We talk about it every year. For starters, the NBA wants its focus during the finals to be on the series, the product on the court. Now, last year with Kevin Durant, those negotiations were a little bit of an exception, but that's a rare circumstance in which the Suns were trading a soon-to-be 37-year-old, so there was time pressure on that front. They knew they had wanted to do it for months. They had tried to do it at the trade deadline in February, and they also wanted a pick in that year's draft, and so they needed to know if they had one so that they could research and decide what they wanted to do with it if they were able to execute a deal. And so that was a unique set of factors that really expedited the process. For the most part, we know it's a deadline-driven league, and we see that each year at the trade deadline, where talks don't really pick up until the week or so before the deadline. That's when teams feel more confident they're getting best offers around the league. And in June, the two inflection points on the calendar in terms of exerting any time pressure, that's the draft, which this year is June 23rd and June 24th. Rockets currently in line to pick at 39th and 53rd overall, both of those picks in the second round. And then the second date is the opening of free agency on June 30th. So it's about a week from now and a week before the draft. I think that's the window in which we'll get some more concrete intel on what the Rockets' plans are, what they're going to do or not do. They'll also have an exclusive negotiating window with Tari Eason right after the finals end and prior to restricted free agency. So with that in mind, we're going to shelve the micro until then. And we're going to have one more pod that's a little more macro in nature, talking about team building strategies and specifically in regards to the ongoing finals between the Spurs and the Knicks. So the way we're going to structure today's show, I want to do one segment on each team and the implications for the Rockets from a team building perspective. But the initial segment is going to be on Stephon Castle, because that's the one angle where there is some concrete, some specific reporting actually specific to the Rockets. I'm going to read off what Sam Amick wrote in The Athletic after interviewing Castle during the finals, and then Paulo, you and I can give our reactions to it. Castle, of course, was picked by the Spurs at number 4 in the 2024 draft, one slot after the Rockets took Reed Sheppard at number 3. To this point, Steph has clearly been the better player, although the circumstances are very different in terms of their initial role, the team around them. Obviously, it helps to have Wemby on your side. And then there's the matter of the sample just being so insanely small. Both of these guys just 21 years old, year 2. There's still so much time for further development, for things to change. Anyway, let's get to the reporting. This is initially Sam Amick's writing, followed by a direct quote from Castle. While the UConn product saw himself as the best player in that draft, he was less focused on going number 1 and more concerned with fit. At the time, there were reports that Castle's choice not to conduct private workouts with several teams was driven by his desire to avoid teams that already had an established starting point guard. One of those teams was the Houston Rockets, who ultimately took Reed Sheppard out of Kentucky with the 3rd pick. Per league sources, Rockets coach and former Spurs assistant Ime Udoka was a huge fan of Castle's, which Castle said he was well aware of. But with veteran Fred VanVleet manning the point guard position and young Jalen Green at the two-guard spot, Castle and his camp sent the kinds of signals Houston's way that eventually led to him landing in San Antonio, just as he had hoped. I think being in San Antonio was always number one on my list, said Castle, who won Rookie of the Year in 2025. Internally, I always felt like I was the best player in that draft, but I didn't know what could happen. So, I wasn't really planning on playing in Houston, but I didn't know how any of that worked. I was kind of hoping I could slide my way to San Antonio, and it kind of worked out for me. To say the least, it did. In year two, he's playing a key role on a finals team that is way ahead of schedule. So, in terms of implications for the Rockets, Paulo, I'll give you the first chance to respond. When you read that this morning, I know your initial reaction, because we talked offline, was to stay off of Twitter. But more practically, when you hear those words from Castle, when you see that reporting from Sam Amick about Castle and the Rockets, what's your reaction as far as the key takeaways and what perhaps we shouldn't take away as well?
To me, it's really, and I worry about what people react to this take, but to me, it's not really something I'm worried about. It is like, to me, this is not the same as the Wemby celebrating not going to the Rockets thing. Because that could have been construed as okay, this franchise is like not something I'm looking forward to going to. It's a reputation thing. With Castle, to me, it makes sense. Right? You're looking at a team that has Fred, that has Jalen Green, who at that point in time didn't necessarily look like he was going anywhere. And so it made all of the sense in the world that a guy picked top 5, wanted, the ability to prove his worth and to show that he's a star. Playing with Wemby for any guard ever has got to be enticing. And so I don't think this is an indictment on the Rockets as a franchise or the perception or anything like that. I think it makes sense. It's not the first time it has happened. It's not the last time it will happen. Players try to nudge their way onto certain teams, and he's a Spur now, right? And he could have just went ballistic and said, "Oh, I was never going to play for this team," or that. We've seen players do that before after they've landed in the destination they want to be at. That didn't seem to be the vibe. I think he just wanted somewhere where it was wide open. Come in, you're going to be the point guard from day one, and you've got all of the space in the world. We can discuss if that's the best approach or not for a prospect, but it doesn't really matter. I think as far as what impacts the Rockets, I think that's not necessarily something negative. And it's, as it happens with other prospects, it's then up to the team that has the chance to pick the guy anyway. And if the Rockets have picked Castle anyway, and we can go into whether that would have been the right call or not, or if we have enough data to judge on that. But it's up to the team to make that pick, and I do think that if the Rockets had picked Castle, he would have played here. Like, I don't think this is a holdout type of situation. It's more of a, hey, I prefer to go there, but if it doesn't work out, then obviously he's going to be fighting for his career somewhere else. In this case, in Houston. So to me, it's always kind of funny how the timing on these things, right? Because this is an interview that's not about this. This is a little bit of an interview that someone is reporting on, right? And so makes me think that the timing is like that. There's nothing behind it. Like, I don't like. Sometimes with these reports, you can go and trying to figure out why is this coming out at the time that it is coming out, right? Knowing how it came out, like the context, like this is an interview of Stephon Castle, and then, there's this little bit, and someone picked this little bit up and went and dug up and journalists doing his job, did further reporting and got sources saying about this specific team, this is how it went down. The entire thing about, Udoka being a big fan and all of that stuff makes me think that it's, the timing is just coincidental, right? Because if not, right, if this was a piece like strictly about that in specific, like if it weren't taken out of a bigger interview, I think there could be some speculation about, why is this coming out now? Like, is this, maybe Udoka trying to protect his own image, as he's gotten criticism for not playing Reed enough, and Rockets have gotten criticism for not picking Castle ahead of Reed, which would seem like the correct pick at this moment in time. Is this someone trying to protect themselves? No, I don't think that that's the case at all. Looking at the context of it, of course, just seems like something that originated out of a bigger story, and then someone took that detail and went and dug into it and found out this information. But to me, this is, and it's getting blown out of proportion, because at this moment in time, Reed looks like he's not as good as Castle, or at least in this moment in time, he's not. We'll see how that develops, and that's why it's kind of blowing up. It's a very fun time to make fun of the Rockets, because they were a first round exit, very underwhelming season, and it's a perfect time to prop up the Spurs, who are in the NBA Finals very early on in their franchise trajectory with the score, and so I think that's why it blew up. As far as consequence for the Rockets, I think if there's any analysis to be done, it's about what the process was that led to picking Reed over Castle, or to kind of acquiesce to Castle's preference. If we want to talk about that as well, I think that's the bigger issue. I don't think this is a reputational thing, and I don't think this is a symptom of some sort of disgruntlement within the franchise at all.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to discuss. And I'll close the loop on the sourcing of that interview. It's clear as day. This is a direct conversation with Stephon Castle. I saw some talk on Twitter of whether this was the Rockets trying to do some damage control, and with Steph showing off in the finals for their chief rival less than 200 miles away, is this them trying to spin them not picking him 2 years ago? No, this is a one-on-one conversation between Sam Amick and Stephon Castle. It's that simple. If you read the actual article, that's why it's important to do the work, to not just read an aggregated snippet on social media, but find the original source. The original source is a conversation with Stephon Castle. So, the Ime Udoka anecdote, it's been speculated really ever since the draft that Castle feels like an Ime Udoka type of player. So, of course, Sam Amick is going to ask about that. It's a natural talking point. With that said, I don't think you want an entire roster of players that are all of the same type. You need different blends. You need some players that are more tilted towards offense, some that are more tilted towards defense. And in Houston, they already had Amen Thompson and Tari Eason. So I could see a scenario where, the Rockets insist that they still think Reed was the right pick, that they believe he can be an offensive engine, the best player in his draft class. Obviously, he's nowhere close to that yet. He's also just 21 years old. And so I could see a world where between Amen, Tari, Ime Udoka, the Rockets thought, and Ime could be on board with this as well, that even if stylistically Steph Castle is that bulldog that would seem to fit more with what Ime Udoka wants to do, that Reed is a better fit given the surrounding roster and how the entire puzzle fits together. So it's entirely possible that Ime Udoka does like Stephon Castle as a player, and yet the Rockets, with Ime Udoka also being on board, ultimately decided that Reed was the better fit. And in terms of the implications for the entire basketball operations department in Houston, led by Rafael Stone, you alluded to that, Paulo, and to me, that's the more important thing, the more important angle to dissect. Because just as much as we talk about what was reported by Sam Amick, we should also acknowledge what wasn't reported. And that's anything about Reed Sheppard or any regret from the Rockets about that selection, because I haven't heard it myself, and it's not in any of the reports that we've seen. And that's what you have to keep in mind. It is possible for multiple things to be true. And so I've seen some folks on social media trying to tie it back in with the 2021 draft, when there were some whispers at the time that Evan Mobley might not have wanted to work out for the Rockets because Houston had Kevin Porter Jr. and there was allegedly some bad blood from the USC pipeline. That was never confirmed, but there were whispers of it at the time. And ultimately, the Rockets picked Jalen Green at 2. Evan Mobley went at 3 to the Cavaliers. And to this point, Evan Mobley has been the better pick. And so I've seen some talk amongst Rockets fans that maybe this is that same scenario again. And I will say, from a process standpoint, it would be concerning if, for a second time in 4 years, the Rockets went against their own instincts as far as the best player available for that draft slot and basically got bullied by a rookie or his agency into taking a secondary option. That would be concerning with an asset that's that important to team building if you're picking in the top 3 of a draft. However, there are no firm indications in either of those years that that's what happened. There has never been any reporting, I haven't heard it myself, I haven't seen it, that the Rockets preferred Evan Mobley to Jalen Green, but went for Jalen because Jalen was more on board with playing in Houston. No, the Rockets simply preferred Jalen as a prospect. So did many other people around the NBA. It just so happens that to this point, Evan's been better. Now, Jalen hasn't been terrible. He's a solid NBA player. He just hasn't been quite worthy of his draft slot. And sometimes that's going to happen. And that's why I think it's important to distinguish between process and result. If your process is flawed, that's pretty alarming. And I do think, in a world where these rookies don't really have that much leverage, unless they're willing to sit out an entire year and not get paid and wait for the next draft class, eventually these situations work themselves out. We saw it last year with Ace Bailey and the Utah Jazz, where it was reported prior to the draft that Bailey didn't want to go to Utah, and yet the Jazz stared him down, and he looks like a pretty promising player to this point. Like, there's no reason the Rockets should be going against their own instincts because a rookie doesn't initially want to play there, especially because these circumstances can change. The funny thing about, Stephon Castle wanting to go somewhere that there wasn't a lead guard, well, within a year, Jalen Green had been traded to the Suns for Kevin Durant. And by the way, kudos to Rafael Stone for at least mitigating the damage of the Jalen Green miss by including him as salary matching filler in the Kevin Durant trade. And then the Spurs traded for De'Aaron Fox, drafted Dylan Harper at number 2. Oh, and the Rockets also lost Fred VanVleet to a torn ACL. So within a year, both of the guards that Sam Amick cited, Fred and Jalen, were off the Rockets roster this past season. And the Spurs had acquired 2 starting level players in the 12 months after drafting Castle. So for starters, situations can change. Not saying that Castle regrets being on the Spurs. I'm just mentioning that as useful context. That's why you don't put serious weight on these initial evaluations by players or their agents, because it doesn't take much for the entire landscape to change. You've got to do what you think is best from a basketball standpoint. And if the Rockets were taking, lesser players on their board for the sake of vibes, then yeah, I agree. That would be alarming. However, I don't see any indications, and there aren't any in this report, that that's what happened. There is no reporting that the Rockets took Reed Sheppard or Jalen Green instead of Stephon Castle or Evan Mobley because the latter 2 players didn't want to be in Houston. They simply believed in Reed Sheppard and Jalen Green as prospects. And, maybe if it's close, if you're truly torn, then maybe, one player's desire to be on your team could be something of a tiebreaker. But in these cases, I don't even think it's that. I just think the Rockets concluded that Jalen and Reed were the right picks. Now, while I think the process is understandable, I don't think Rafael Stone and the Rockets front office got bullied out of any pick since Rafael took the job. In terms of the result, I've said it before. If Reed Sheppard turns out to be a serious miss, then yeah, that's a major indictment, because the Rockets drafted in the top 4 in 4 straight years. And I think at this point it's clear there's still development to be had for all of these guys, but Amen Thompson, Jabari Smith Jr., those are good winning players. And perhaps Amen eventually becomes a legit star level player. 2 of the 4 you feel good about. The other 2, Jalen, I hesitate to use the term bust because he is a solid player, but he wasn't what you would expect from number 2 overall, especially with Evan Mobley going right behind him. And Reed Shepherd, if he can't ever improve defensively, there is still a lot of time, but let's play out the worst case scenario. And the guy picked right after him, Stephon Castle, is legitimately an all-star, then at that point, you're looking at a world in which the Rockets blew 50% of their top 4 picks, where you would expect a pretty good chance at landing a very good player. That would be alarming, but we're not there yet. It's still very early, and if Reed Shepherd pans out, then if the Rockets hit on 3 of the 4, 75%, that's a pretty good hit rate. Like, hardly anyone goes 4 for 4. You know, the years prior to, you look at the Spurs, we talk about their luck and how well they drafted. Well, before the Wemby, Castle, and Dylan Harper years, they drafted Josh Primo and Jeremy Sohan. Like, no team bats 1,000. It's hard, even in the lottery, even high in the lottery. And so if Jalen Green is the one miss and the Rockets hit on the other 3, then that's fine. But if Jalen and Reed are both misses, and so from those tanking years, well, Reed wasn't a tanking pick, but we can include him because it's the same time window. Reed was from the Nets. Whether the Rockets have a 50% hit rate or a 75% hit rate, yeah, that, at the end of the day, may define Rafael Stone's tenure with the Rockets. So from a result standpoint, yeah, the Rockets have a lot invested in Reed Shepherd. And if he doesn't work out, then yeah, there's going to be some hard conversations to be had in a couple of years, especially if the team isn't progressing to the extent that we want. But in terms of the process, which I think is the point that you raised, Paulo, and what some people on social media have brought up in the aftermath of this reporting, I think it's important to acknowledge not just the reporting, but also what wasn't reporting. There are no indications, no one is alleging that the Rockets didn't take Stephon Castle or didn't take Evan Mobley because of fear of those 2 players not wanting to be in Houston. And it's possible for multiple things to be true at one time. It's possible, I've seen some suggestions that, well, why would you take a player if the coach doesn't like him? It's possible that Ime Udoka likes both Stephon Castle and Reed Shepherd for different reasons. There is no reporting that Ime Udoka doesn't like Reed Shepherd. There is no reporting that the Rockets got bullied out of taking Stephon Castle. So just as much as we acknowledge, what is reported, we should also talk about what isn't. And to this point, the process seems sound. I can understand it. And it's not like the Rockets were out on an island. There were plenty of other people around the NBA that liked Jalen Green and liked Reed Shepherd in those draft spots as well. So I think the process is defensible. The result, it's going to depend on how Reed develops, but we sort of already knew that. I guess that's how I would put a bow on this. Paulo, how do you look at it in terms of, not just the result, which I think is sort of obvious, but also the process questions?
I think it's pretty obvious that the Rockets had Reed ahead of Castle at the very least. Some reports say they had him number 1 on their board. Obviously, they did not have my guy, Khalil Ware, there. That's another debate. So, yeah, I think it's clear they didn't select Reed because of this Castle thing. And that may be a blessing or that can be a curse as well, because if it turns out, and we can get into it, that Castle is just an all-star and Reed's just a 6th man or someone who can't stand the floor because of his defense, then, that's a curse because, as you said at that point, how good is this front office at assessing talent in the draft, right? Because at that point, you clearly missed on Jalen Green, and I was someone who advocated for taking Jalen Green, but it's not my job. So at that point, you've missed. There's 2 drafts in which you clearly missed. In one, a DPOY, the pick after, or a perennial all-star in Scotty Barnes. A few picks after, but you could have realistically picked Scotty Barnes at 2 in that draft. I don't think that would be insanely crazy. There were people who had Scotty Barnes that high. And then, the Jabari draft could maybe make an argument that you should have taken Jalen Williams, but you're not going to take a guy projected outside the top 10 at pick 3. So I think Jabari was just a straight up correct pick at that stage within the options that were there. And then the year after, as you said, the Pickman Thompson, just very clearly the correct pick at the stage that he was picked at. Nobody close to his upside or his impact picked after him in the short range after him. And then the redraft, if it turns out Stephon Castle was the correct pick, then you should get a major negative, I guess, mark for having taken him. But I don't think that the Rockets were bullied into anything. And as far as determining which one of them is better, well, right now Castle is clearly better. He's playing in the NBA Finals. He's one of the most important players on the court. But it has to be said at the same time that even though I wasn't a big Castle guy, so I may be biased, but I also wasn't a big Reed guy at the time. I guess he was the best out of bad options at pick 3. If you put Castle in the current Rockets setup, the spacing is going to be still an even bigger issue. Castle's not going to get as many open shots as he gets because he's playing with Wemby. Castle's not going to get as many easy assists as he gets because he has Wemby both as a lob threat, as someone he can feed, as someone he can kick out to, and someone who's drawing so much attention offensively that you have an easier time finding shooters open. Like, it's just, complete opposite circumstances for both players. If you put Reed Shepard on the Spurs right now, how much better does Reed Shepard look? Probably a lot better because defensively he's got Wemby behind him, so who really cares? He can get blown by all he wants. He's got, best defender probably ever by the time he's done playing behind him. And then offensively, he's got all of the space in the world to operate. To me, he's much more of a pick and roll ball handler and a better passer than Castle is, even though the assist numbers don't match up because, well, worse offense. I think Reed would be thriving if he played with Wemby. But we'll probably be sure about what those two guys look like in a couple of years. And at that time, we'll be able to have, a better understanding and actually make a definitive judgment on how the Rafael Stone regime is when it comes to drafting. You wish you would know now because we've talked about, future outlooks and how we would build a team and, what we would like to see done. Probably would rather have a full definitive opinion on it right now, but it's still too early to tell. But yeah, it's one of those things that a fan base that's done in the deeps because the season that we just had and how bleak the future outlook looks was at least with the rest of the competition in the NBA versus a fan base that's just on top of the world right now. Could be even more on top if they weren't down to 2-1 in the finals. But, it's just a reflection of a fan base that's looking for things to point out that are wrong and to be outraged at. And the fan base that's the complete opposite. And in a national fandom perspective that the Rockets are in a bad place and then the Spurs are in the top of the world, people like to if there's one thing that we've learned about social media is that people love dunking on each other. So I think it's mostly that rather than I don't think that there's anything structural that's wrong other than the potential, as you said, that the front office may be just poor drafting, which would be really bad. Well, it's too early to tell.
Yeah, and let's talk about the Spurs specifically. Full disclosure, we are recording this before Game 4 goes final. So even though this will hit everyone's feeds on Thursday, we're talking without knowing if it's 2-2 between the Knicks and Spurs or hopefully 3-1 in favor of the Knicks. But either way, the Knicks are extremely competitive in this series. They're holding their own and then some on the biggest stage, which is great if you're a Rockets fan and hate the Spurs, which you absolutely should be. We'll never understand the folks that are somehow on the Spurs bandwagon because they're from Texas. Come on now. I mean, there's so many reasons not to do that. But in terms of, big picture implications for the Rockets from a team building perspective, I don't think whether it's 2-2 or 3-1 by the time folks are listening to this episode, I don't think that's going to change anything all that significantly, barring some sort of catastrophic injury, which we certainly hope doesn't happen for anyone. So, in terms of looking at it from a Spurs perspective, and we will do the Knicks as well, although we'll save that for last since the Knicks are not a direct rival. They play in the East, et cetera, et cetera. There are a few interesting takeaways there, but I think the Spurs are the more direct comparison and the, unfortunate one because they're your chief rival. They're located less than 200 miles away, and yet they've clearly jumped a tier ahead of you in the Western Conference. And We talked about this a little bit in our last show, which was about 2.5 weeks ago, coming off the first game or two of the Western Conference Finals. Wemby had that insane game one where I think he went for like 40 and 20 in the double overtime win. And we talked about the team building implications of having not one, but two juggernauts in the Western Conference, the Spurs and the Thunder, and why that probably will make the Rockets a little more conservative this offseason, not making the all-in type move for a Giannis, but holding on to those future draft assets, having more bites at the apple in terms of getting a true difference maker in the draft or someone via trade. Maybe there's a Luka type scenario down the road. Monitoring the Timberwolves and Anthony Edwards, by the way. I don't know if that can happen this offseason, but that report from Brian Windhorst last week that, Edwards is not thrilled with that roster. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what it sounded like to me. I do wonder, probably won't happen anytime soon because they don't have Nico Harrison, but we can certainly hope. That might be a scenario where the Rockets, instead of keeping those future draft picks, they actually do go all in, so to speak. But unless it's for someone that's in age alignment with the Amin Thompson-led young core, I think the key takeaway from the Spurs being at that tier with the Thunder are, as we said in our last show, or the last one with me and you, Paulo. I had an episode in between with Dave Hardesty and the creative folks for the Rockets who were involved with the new uniform. If you haven't heard that, please check out our archives. But in terms of, team building, I think, unfortunately, the takeaway from the Spurs jumping to that top tier with the Thunder, maybe even ahead of them, they certainly are this season, is that the Rockets have to be a little more patient. It wouldn't be prudent to mortgage those future picks for a Giannis-type player if he's going to shorten your window and you may not be at that top level anyway. So I don't want to rehash what we've said in prior shows. I think that analysis, which you can find in our archives, largely still applies. I'm actually going to spin it a little more positively. Relative to our last show, and certainly since the end of the Western Conference Finals, I'm actually a little more optimistic. Not for next season, because I do think that, regardless of what the Spurs do or don't do in this series, there's a tier gap, and Wemby, Dylan Harper, Stephon Castle, you should only expect them to improve given how young they are in their careers. Maybe down the road there's issues with injuries or contractual matters, but you cross that bridge when you come to it. You certainly don't anticipate it. So even if the Spurs don't win the title this year, they're young enough to where just simply being at this level and with further growth and development anticipated, I'm not optimistic on the Rockets realistically being able to get to their level next season. Now, maybe you get lucky and, there's an injury or there's, something on the chemistry front that goes awry, but you don't plan on that. So when I say optimistic, I'm not saying, I think the Rockets are ready to be true contenders next season. No, although I do think they'll certainly be more competitive with Fred VanVleet and Steven Adams and, of course, Kevin Durant, who they didn't have in the playoffs, and that's assuming they run it back. If they don't, then, we'll talk about that next week in terms of, some of the scenarios of changing the roster this offseason. I'm talking about simply what they have today. But in terms of, the future, the reason I was so despondent, and Paulo, offline, we always talk, and after that game 7 between the Spurs and the Thunder, I was basically having a sports fan life crisis because my reaction was, hey, if the Spurs are already a generational type team, which on paper to win game 6 and game 7 against the defending champions, the 7th game on the road against a team with the 2-time MVP playing out of his mind, on paper, you would think that's a generational team. And you combine that with how young those core guys are. Wemby in his first playoff run. Stephon Castle in year 2. Dylan Harper, a true rookie. Then after game 7, it felt almost hopeless. Like if the Spurs, and some of it's blind luck, how they got Wemby, how they somehow moved up from 8 to 2 in the Dylan Harper draft, and he looks like a potentially foundational piece as well. My initial reaction was, especially if you're a fan of the rival team less than 200 miles away, and you're coming off, a dynasty in the Tim Duncan years where the Spurs, won 5 titles in 15 years. it's sort of like, what the hell is the point if you can't compete with these guys and the team that's winning all these titles is your biggest rival and they've already lapped you in the past 20 plus years. I've mellowed on that a little bit simply because I think the combination of seeing the Knicks succeed in this series and then remembering that the Thunder, SGA played well in that game 7, but for most of the series he did not. And then the reality that they didn't have Jalen Williams or AJ Mitchell, probably their second and third best players. So while it's certainly impressive to beat the Thunder no matter what, and to win a game 7 on the road, this was not the juggernaut Thunder that we saw for most of this season. This was not the championship Thunder from 2025. This was an OKC team that, when I look back at that game 7 and I rewatch the key possessions, it felt like outside of SGA, there just wasn't enough creative juice. There just weren't enough bodies. And so the Spurs certainly deserve credit for winning, but it's not like they truly took down the Thunder at the peak of their powers. And when you follow up that series with the Knicks being extremely competitive, again, whether it's 2-2 or 3-1 by the time you're listening, I don't think it changes the fact that the Knicks have been extremely competitive in this series. I think it's not to say that, the Spurs are super vulnerable. No, I mean, they deserve to be in the finals, and they're going to be even better next year, barring major injuries. But I do think that, maybe some of us, certainly me, I think we were putting the cart in front of the horse in terms of coronating the Spurs after the Western Conference Finals. Still very, very good, but they're not quite at that super team generational level just yet because the Thunder had their injuries and the Knicks, look, this is a great story. They play well together. They also won 53 games in the Eastern Conference. This is not a super team, and they are giving the Spurs all they can handle in the finals. So some of what happened with the Spurs and OKC is simply situational. And yeah, it sucks that the Spurs had great luck yet again with the injuries, but in terms of, how good is this team? They're very, very good. I don't think they are a generational team, at least not this year's version, because the reason that's important to me, if this year's team was generational and you combine it with the expected improvement from those young guys, then yeah, it would be pretty devastating. I think the more accurate way to frame it is that this year's Spurs team is very good and, assuming health, can be expected to further improve, but they're not yet generational. And while I don't think that puts the Rockets, a 52-win team in the West at a point where you can realistically compete for the title next season, barring major injuries, I don't think that maybe all hope is lost to the extent that, at least to me, it felt like after Game 7. Not saying my outlook has radically transformed. I still think it's important to, be very protective of those future draft picks unless there's an Anthony Edwards type situation. Like, I think you need as many bites at the apple as you can to get a generational prospect, which, is most likely going to come through the draft. The Luka type scenarios via trade are outliers. So I think the hope for the Rockets, they're set up pretty well, between their own pick, the Nets and the Suns in 27, their own pick, the Mavs and the Suns in 29. Those are 2 years in the next 3 in which the Rockets will have basically 3 bites at the apple. They'll get the 2 best picks of those 3 teams in each year. And in this new NBA draft lottery where the odds are more flat, they might get lucky in one of those years in much the same way the Spurs did. And so I still think, as I said after Game 1, that's the prudent play with how good the Spurs are. But I'm not quite as despondent as I was coming off the Western Conference Finals when I consider the injuries of the Thunder and I look at what the Knicks are doing against the Spurs. So I guess that's my attempt to, not sunshine pump, but at least have a little bit of optimism. Paulo, from a Spurs perspective, how are you feeling about, what it means for the Rockets and what they should or shouldn't do this offseason and beyond?
Well, after the Western Conference Finals, I wasn't as down as you were, but now I'm not as up as you are, basically, because to me, yes, coming off the conference finals, I did think the Spurs were better right now than they are right now. The injuries on the Thunder and just uncharacteristically bad games from Shea. And now the Knicks, who are not, like, to me, they're not an outstanding team. I'm sorry. I know they won 13 in a row or whatever it may be. But to me, they're not all that. The fact that they're putting up a fight is positive. And more importantly, they've shown some weaknesses in Wemby's game that a lot of people didn't necessarily project because of his size that make me more confident that there might be something you can exploit throughout his career. And we'll see how that develops, and I'll get into more detail in just a little bit. But at the same time, I do expect them, like, they're not a generational team right now. I expect them that by next year, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, that they will be, because I think Wemby is going to be the best player in the league, and I think he's got a pretty decent chance at being the best player of all time if he has the longevity and if he capitalizes on his chances. And so that's one of the things. I think Harper is going to be a top 10 player in the league. I think he's got real likely James Harden type upside as a combo guard. And so when you combine that, like, imagine if James Harden had Wemby. And he's probably not going to be as good as James Harden, but still, it'll be just insane. So and that's forgetting the other things. They still have Castle, who might not be the perfect fit, but he's a decent enough fit. And they still have a load of not cap space, but of salary that they can move to make more targeted improvements to the team. Like, they could very easily trade for Giannis. But it doesn't need to be that. They could very easily just trade for Trey Murphy and Alex Caruso or someone of the type. Obviously not Alex Caruso, because the Thunder are not going to trade him. But players of the type, and just have elite, third best player on a championship team at worst on every spot of the starting lineup with 2 superstars and an all-star. Right? I think it's very likely that this is what's going to happen in the next few years. I think the Spurs are a well-run enough organization that they will be able to do stuff like that. Now, they may misstep, but you can't necessarily bank on that to build your future strategy. So, yes, they're not as good right now as I thought they were. I still think that they'll be just as good as they were going to be anyway. Because at a certain point, like, there's a ceiling, right? You're never going to be 20 points better than every other team in the league, even if you have the talent to do so, because it's human nature. You're going to let off. And like, even the Warriors have teams like the Rockets who brought them to the brink and beat them with LeBron and the Cavs. So, yeah, I just think that we're looking at probably a better team, a better dynasty than what the Warriors were, and that's scary. So I think that's what they have to take into consideration moving forward in the way that they build, and just find the best way to, like, what you need, like what the Rockets need is the Rockets need top 10 player in the league for the foreseeable future to build around without completely destroying every asset that they have. Because just a top 10 player in the league, if you have to lose half your team and all of your picks, isn't worth it. You're not going to win anything. Like, if you go and get Giannis, who is a top 5 player in the league in my book still, but you lose everything that you have and you don't have a team that fits and you can't build upon that, you're not going to get to that level. And you're not going to be there long enough to have a decent enough chance for it to be worth it, that one of these years you can beat the Spurs, right? I think the Rockets can, like, unless there is another generational player in the next few drafts, which there might be, you never know, and you want to have a chance to draft them if there are, the Rockets are going to need to be what the Rockets were to the Warriors, which is a team that gets them to 7 consistently, that 1 year might be able to do it. And the Rockets could have done it, if not for Scott Forster, or if not for some James Harden playoff choke jobs, if not for some injuries, right? The Rockets got unlucky, but there's a very real world out there in which the Rockets won a championship with James Harden. And if the Rockets can get to a team quality high enough to be what the Rockets were with the Warriors, but now with the Spurs, then I think at that point it would be worth it. And you would have accomplished your goal for this rebuilding cycle. Because the Rockets were there every year. They have a real shot against the Warriors. It just didn't happen for multiple reasons that just didn't go their way. But it was a high enough chance that it was worth doing. I don't think anybody looks back and thinks, oh, the Rockets should have been rebuilding throughout the entire James Harden career in Houston. So, yeah, I think that's what the Rockets should be aiming for. Now, to talk about specific things. Now, the Knicks are showing us some things, right? The Knicks are showing us that spacing against Wemby is absolutely key because you can't allow him to be, to be playing free roam or to be, in the paint, having the massive defensive impact that he has. So spacing is absolutely key. You cannot have more than one non-shooter. And if that non-shooter is involved in the action, then that's even better. Like involved in the pick and roll as the ball handler, as the roller, then that's even better. And the other thing is offensively, Wemby's game is nowhere near as polished as his stats suggest. In the sense that he is still very jump shot reliant, depending on matchup, right? Like most really, really tall guys, the way you defend them is not by sticking an even taller guy or a comparable taller guy to contest the jump shots. You're likely not going to contest or block the jump shot anyway. What you got to do is what the Rockets did way back then on a smaller scale with PJ Tucker on Anthony Davis, for example. You put a stocky guy, which for Wemby, since he's not 6'11", he's 7'5", likely has to be a stocky, really good defender that's center-sized at the very least, right? Doesn't need to be Chet, but can be a guy like Bam or a guy like Karl Anthony Towns, for example, or a guy like OG Anunoby, for example. That seems to be what brings Wemby the most trouble because he, for some reason, looks like a guy that has been training to be a guard for a really long time. And so he's a lot more comfortable starting from the perimeter and playing like a guard than he is, posting up and backing down guys in a traditional center, type of game. And so now that's interesting because if he does develop that inside game, which it looks like he's been working on, obviously the clips with the Hakeem, then he might just become truly unstoppable. But in the meantime, until he does it, that is something that you can exploit, right? Like Karl Anthony Towns in the league might not have the defensive reputation because he was so good offensively for so long. But if you go back and you look at his draft profile, Karl Anthony Towns was a defensive guy. Not only a defensive guy, but he was the number 1 overall pick because he was a really, really good defender in college. And then he came into the NBA and, perhaps some of it is him being misused or miscoached. But now with the Knicks, they are putting him in a situation in which he is center size and he is stocky. In which you probably need, if you want to, what the Rockets are going to have to do is do what they did with the Warriors. The way you beat the Warriors was you try to compete with them on the 3-point shooting equation, and you build switching defense 1 through 5. And that's, what the Rockets got the Rockets so close to beating the Warriors that they didn't, by 3 unlucky circumstances in CP3, Scott Foster, and James Harden's playoff struggles / Trevor releases. There might be an avenue to building a team to counter Wemby. Now, I'm not sure if you can counter Wemby and counter superstar Derek Harper again. Dylan Harper at the same time if he does become that superstar, so that's still scary. But there are some, chinks in the armor for how Wemby has played now. And, I'll leave it to you, Ben, because you brought it up in conversation beforehand, so I'll let you bring that up as well, the rebounding stuff. There seem to be these holes on Wemby's game that perhaps you can exploit long-term if you build a team specifically to beat him. But whatever team you, even against the Warriors, the Rockets built a team specifically to beat the Warriors, but they still needed 2 superstars to get close. And the Rockets right now have no superstars beyond Kevin Durant, who's likely not going to be here for Wemby's prime. So, or for all of the time that Wemby is going to be competitive. So, that part's still to be fixed, and that's a pretty big part of the equation. But it's perhaps not as hopeless. Ben was pretty hopeless between me and you guys. Ben was pretty hopeless at the end of the Western Conference Finals. I'm not hopeless. I'm just aware of how gargantuan of a challenge it's going to be. But there's ways for it to be done. You just gotta hit big on either the draft or betting on a guy like James Harden, who perhaps on volume can be a superstar but hasn't gotten the chance to, which is, funnily enough, exactly what the Knicks did with Jalen Brunson. Jalen Brunson was a sixth man for the Mavs. And then they gave him volume, and now he's a superstar and, great clutch player in the playoffs. And now they may be able to beat Wemby because they found him. Maybe that's the way you do it. Maybe, I don't know, just throwing it out there. Maybe Ayo Dosunmu, who in very limited high usage role in the playoffs, look like potential star. Maybe there's more guys like that out there. Maybe that's the bet you take. Maybe it's not entirely through the draft, but the Rockets are not going to compete with the Spurs without getting bona fide superstars, and it's not going to be through a bunch of 1B or two number twos or number threes, depending on how you think Alperen Sengun is going to develop. That they're going to get there, so they've got to continue swinging for upside, because I don't think the team as currently set up is going to be reaching those heights without some more variance slotted into it. Is what I'll say.
Let's wrap up by looking at the Knicks specifically. You already started that transition, so we'll just extend that, looking at how the Knicks built this team. And I'll start with a couple of broad observations about the group. I think two things that really stand out about them that could be applicable to the Rockets. They are extremely physical, which that could be an analog for what the Rockets are trying to build under Ime Udoka. Stylistically, there are some similarities there. And then from a chemistry standpoint, the team is better than the sum of its parts. It just is. Now, can the Rockets have that type of chemistry? I don't know. We'll see. But one thing Rafael Stone said during this past season, and he's right, this year's Rockets team did not have the benefit of continuity with so many changes, and then you add in the injuries on top of it. Next year's Rockets team, if they keep it together, and even if they don't, maybe you have to extend out the timeline a little bit more, but at some point the Rockets will get a chance to have more continuity, and then it's not as easy as just keeping the team together and automatically you're going to have the chemistry that these Knicks have. But what the Knicks offer is hope that even in the star-driven NBA, a team can be better than the sum of its individual parts if the fit is right, and especially if you're able to play physical in a playoff setting, which we know is important, and the Knicks are showing just how vital it is. I look back at those Rockets-Spurs matchups this year. 3 of the 4, the Rockets didn't have Steven Adams, and I just think for the reasons you laid out, Paulo, it's so important to crash the offensive glass against the Spurs. First, you've got to force Wemby to come out and to commit to defending a shot. And what the Knicks have done so well in this series is crash the offensive glass when Wemby vacates that space near the basket. And it doesn't even have to be three-point shooting. It could be as simple as, we know, the adjustment of Wemby on Amen. Give Amen a reliable mid-range shot to where Wemby simply has to come out to 15 feet. And if so, there's still an ability to crash the offensive glass. Well, in the meetings this year, the Rockets didn't have Steven Adams for 3 of the 4. And then what I think you really need against San Antonio is rebounding from the wing positions in those scenarios where Wemby comes out. The Knicks have had that with Josh Hart and OG Anunoby. The one game where the Rockets did have Steven Adams, it was that NBA Cup meeting back in November. If you recall, Keldon Johnson absolutely bullied Tari Eason on the offensive glass. It doesn't need to be that way. Tari can be the one doing the bullying. At times, he's been that guy in his NBA career. In fact, that's largely who he was the first 3 seasons. This year, for whatever reason, it wasn't. I suspect because it was a contractual year, he was a little more worried about the offensive end of the court, improving the three-point shooting, and then when he went into the slump, got in his head a little bit. I think if you have physical wings like Amen Thompson, like Tari Eason, who can crash the offensive glass, especially when Wemby comes out and commits, that's the model, that physical defense, which, say what you will about Ime Udoka, physical defense and rebounding, it travels on the road. It's more important in the playoffs. And I think it's more important against a team like the Spurs that has Wemby. Not saying Ime Udoka is a perfect coach, but I do think there's some similarities with the way the Rockets roster is built, the way Ime Udoka is trying to coach with how the Knicks are currently playing. And the chemistry, I'm not saying that for sure the Rockets can do that, but this year they honestly didn't have a chance with all the turnover and the injuries. The hope is that as the years progress and this group stays together, maybe you do get a situation where with continuity, the Rockets can be better than the sum of the individual parts and take the type of leap that the Knicks have done the last couple of playoff runs. In terms of specific team building implications, and this is more on an individual level, I think there's three things to me that stand out about the Knicks. First off, Jalen Brunson took a discount on his contract. He's getting paid, I think, still below $40 million in average annual value. And that's allowed them so much flexibility to build out the rest of that team. So that's why, to this point, the Rockets have negotiated hard with their players. That's one thing that Rafael Stone has done throughout his tenure. And I hope they're able to do the same thing with Amen Thompson this offseason. What the Knicks team building model has showed you is that every dollar counts, especially in the modern NBA with the first and second aprons. And so if you can get an all-NBA level player on below max money, that is really important. So I think Brunson's contract, it tells you the importance of being a stickler in negotiations and or getting your players to buy in on the collective, on the team concept, that if I sacrifice a little bit, it can help me put a better roster around you to this point. I think the Rockets have done that. That could bode well. I think Brunson being acquired via trade and not the draft, it's a reminder that you do have to at least keep an open mind. I mentioned the Anthony Edwards scenario. Again, I think that's a long shot, but while I think keeping those future draft picks is the odds-on likely scenario, you shouldn't be closed off to, if the right player comes along that's in age alignment with Amen Thompson, you can push your chips in earlier. It doesn't make sense to do that for a soon-to-be 32-year-old Giannis, but if someone else, similar to, Brunson a few years ago when the Knicks were able to get him, I believe, in free agency from the Mavs, I think it was a sign and trade, I can't recall, but regardless, they identified him on the market and they went out and got it done. If it wasn't a sign and trade, then it was effectively one because they had to clear cap space to make it work. So I think maintaining an open mind to the fact that while, building through the draft is important, it doesn't have to be that. There are other options. And then finally, I think with Brunson, it's worth noting, if you look at his advanced numbers, and the same is largely true with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, by the way, neither of those guys was showing that they were truly all NBA level cornerstones, and in SGA's case, like an MVP level cornerstone, until at least their fifth seasons. So it wasn't like after year 2, year 3, it was clear that they were destined to be these types of players. It took until they were 23, 24, 25 years old before they truly popped. And I think that's important to keep in mind with certainly Amen Thompson, Reed Shepherd, even Jabari Smith Jr., guys that are between 21 and 23 years old. And in their first 3 seasons, well, Jabari just wrapped up his 4th, but there's so much time for those players to continue developing and improve. I'm not saying that any of those 3 are necessarily going to be stars, but when players are that young, both in age and seasons in the NBA, it doesn't always pop. Like we look at Brunson, SGA, and we can say these are cornerstone level players that were able to truly push, if not beat the Spurs this year. It wasn't clear by the end of year 3 that this is who those 2 players would be. And I bring that up to say there's a lot of people on Rockets Twitter that seem to be convinced that, because Amen Thompson and Reed Shepherd got these opportunities this year and clearly still had some limitations, that, well, they're never going to be at that level. They might not, but you can't conclusively say it based on what they did at 21, 22, 23 years old. There's still a lot of time left, and the hope is that those players continue developing and maybe you get lucky. Not saying for sure it's going to happen, but seeing I don't want to call it late career development, but I think mid-career development is fair to say in the case of Jalen Brunson, certainly was giving him more of an opportunity, but also I think, Dallas isn't stupid. I think if he was that level of player then, they would have played him more. They would have given him more shot attempts. Now, maybe he developed in part because he got additional reps. It can be a blend of the two, but some of it just takes time. It doesn't always happen like it did for Wemby or even Dylan Harper in their first year or two in the NBA. There are a lot of guys who mature and evolve in their careers, and that's what seeing Jalen Brunson reminds me of. So that's my takeaways from the Knicks. Paulo, what's your perspective as we wind down the pod on any implications from the success of the Knicks for what the Rockets should do this offseason and beyond?
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of what you said. Like, I think you made a very good point on rebounding out of the wings, and I think the Rockets are in a prime position to do that if Amen Thompson is a wing and if they keep Tyrese and even Jabari is a pretty good rebounder and someone who, when he sets his mind to it, can grab you 12, 13 boards in a game. But then beyond that, it's a lot of what I already thought about before, which is, you gotta give yourself a chance in the draft, like in a draft in which there is a generational prospect like this one, in which there are, multiple, I think, guys with chances of being generational like this one. You've got to be in a position to have a shot at getting one of those guys, because that's the only way to get those guys. And then there's the other way, which is something that I had not considered before, which is trading for a guy who you believe that, given higher usage, could become a Shea or a Jalen Brunson, right? And, it's hard to get that off the top of my head. I mean, Trey Murphy stayed pretty efficient on high volume after, if you looked at Trey Murphy as a prospect, he was an older prospect. And if you looked at his first couple of seasons in the league, you'd probably think, hey, this guy's probably just a very lengthy 3-and-D guy. And then he went to the Pelicans and Zion's constantly injured and Ingram the same thing. And he's shown the ability to remain efficient at volume. Maybe there's another step there. Who knows? And I'm sure, there's other guys out there that might be the same way. But yeah, the truth remains, even the Knicks have a superstar in Jalen Brunson and a perennial all-star guy in Karl-Anthony Towns, and two of the best 3-and-D wings in the league of two different types. Ojianobi more of a bruiser type. He can still guard perimeter players, obviously, very well. But more of a bruiser type. Mikal Bridges more of a wiry, lengthy type. And so, even this Knicks team is filled with, there's not a single starting player on that lineup that's not elite and brings a different dimension with their game. And they complement each other really well. But, if you gave me the chance to rebuild, if you gave me the chance, hey, in 2 years, the Rockets will have a team of the exact same quality as the Knicks have right now, I wouldn't take it, because I don't think that Knicks team in the West makes it past the second round. But now, they are in the East, and they found a way to get to the finals, and once you get to the finals, weird things happen, right? You've given yourself a shot. The problem with being in the West is you're not gonna get that shot unless you get through both of these teams. OKC and the Spurs. And so you need to aim higher, and I don't think replicating the Knicks is going to be enough to give you a realistic chance at the championship in the next 5 years. I'm not going to project beyond that because that's just too much of a crapshoot. But yeah, I think what the Knicks showed me is more in specific ways in which you can exploit a player like Wemby, which is going to be a big deal. Not necessarily in the way in which you build a team, other than the fact that it reminded me that another way to find a superstar without giving up superstar level value, which is that's what you want to do, because if the Rockets could trade for Giannis, but they give up so much that it defeats the purpose. You're not gonna have enough to build around them to to put together a competitive enough team to compete with the Spurs and the Thunder. What you need to do is either draft one, which is the ultimate way of getting a superstar for the best value possible, or buying low on a guy, or buying not necessarily low, but paying a role player price for a guy that has the upside to be a lot more than a role player when given the usage and just didn't get that chance. And the Knicks reminded me of that from a team building perspective, and contributed to the knowledge base of ways to somewhat exploit Wemby in the future, in the same way that Daryl had to come up with, the strategies that he had to be competitive with the Thunder. And so, yeah, thankful to the Knicks for that.
Well, I'll be most thankful for the Knicks if they win this series, but I don't want to assume that until it happens. Again, we're recording this late Wednesday before Game 4 goes final. Hopefully by the time you're listening, it's 3-1 in favor of New York. But if it's 2-2, I mean, either way, they'll certainly have a chance, and hopefully more than that entering Game 5. And that's, as you said, they're probably not a Spurs or Thunder level team in the West. They're a classic case of, just get to the finals. They do play in a weaker East and give yourself a chance. But I also think, they're a fun team to watch. They're a reminder that you can build a team in different ways. And, your point is well taken as far as them not being a Spurs or Thunder level team in the aggregate. But at the same time, you also have to remember they've had almost nothing in terms of drafting and development. That entire roster almost has been built through strategic trades and free agency signings. So if you're a team like the Rockets and, you can have even a little bit of drafting and development, then combine that with what the Knicks have had on the transaction front, and you'd really have something. Not saying it's that simple. If it was, other teams would do it. But I do think that from a team building perspective, it shows you that there are different ways to get there. And I just think that's so refreshing in today's NBA where, we've talked so much about Wemby being a generational piece who now plays for your biggest rival, the Thunder lucking into a 2-time MVP who's still just 26 or 27 years old. I do think that the Knicks are a team that shows you that teams can be built in different ways. And even if I don't think it's a perfect analog for how the Rockets can build, especially given the pieces that they already have in place, it's not like the Rockets are starting from the bottom. At the same time, I do think that it offers hope. It'll offer more hope if they win the series, but it shows you that you should keep an open mind and that there are more ways to get this done. And in a season that's been largely depressing to be a Rockets fan, they lost so many games in heartbreaking and stupid ways, and you see the Spurs taking at the same time this huge leap. I think the Knicks are a feel-good story for a number of reasons. They also haven't won a title in over 50 years in either of our lifetimes, so I would love to see them win for that reason as well. But I just think it's just a feel-good story for not just the league, but team building. And, we mentioned the gap between the Knicks and the Spurs and the Thunder as well, and the aggregate. It should also be noted that Jalen Brunson, while certainly an all-NBA level player, I certainly don't think he's an MVP. Like, he's not to the level. He's very, very good, and he's capable of being the number one and a contender. We're seeing that now, but he's not SGA. He's not Jokic. He's not Wemby in terms of the total impact, game in, game out. And so I think what the Knicks are doing with a number one that's certainly very good, but I don't think Jalen should seriously get MVP consideration, that offers you more of a buffer as well. It just shows you that if you do the right things and if you have the right model and factors like fit and chemistry, even in the star-driven NBA, even in this era, it still matters. And in some ways, maybe it matters more than ever if you're a team without one of those generational pieces. It makes it all the more important to focus on those things to have any shot at taking a team like that down. Anyway, that's where we'll bring tonight's episode to a close. Again, we will have more episodes in the near future, I think as soon as the finals end, and also with the draft at that point being a week or so out, that's when you'll see a lot of talks picking up around the NBA. It's a deadline-driven league. So in terms of transactions, what the Rockets do or don't do this offseason, the exclusive negotiating window with Tari Eason, the looming start of free agency on June 30th, we'll know a lot more about the Rockets' plans once the finals end and once the draft gets close. The same will be true for most teams around the NBA. So we'll talk more micro roster scenarios in the days and weeks ahead. We're talking more about the Spurs and the Knicks because it's the middle of the NBA Finals. There honestly aren't a ton of rumors other than that Steph Castle tidbit directly pertaining to the Rockets or any NBA team that's not those two. Even the Giannis market hasn't truly picked up yet. So I think we'll do that in the days and weeks ahead. Today, a little more macro. Hope you guys enjoy it. And I promise we'll get back to the micro of the 2026 to 27 Houston Rockets roster very soon. Anyway, for now, I think we're done. Until next time, if you want insight from Paulo or myself, the best place to get it is on social media. My handle is @DuBose. Paulo's is @Paulo Alves NBA. And this show, the Rockets Launch Pod, presented by Clutch Fans. If you go to LaunchPod790 on Twitter/X and you hit up the link tree in the bio, that's got all the links that you need to support friends, partners, sponsors of the show. Clutch Fans, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of the team. Also, individual podcast platforms, Apple, YouTube, Spotify, those types of places. If you haven't already subscribed, already left a positive review, please do. That's how we can look good to those friends, partners, and sponsors and keep this podcast running as one of the most active ones covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, for this Thursday, June 11th, we are officially out. On behalf of Paulo Alves, I'm Ben DuBose. As always, thank you all so much for listening, and please come back soon for more new episodes of the Rockets Launch Pod. Go Knicks.